My name is Andreas Richter, and I'm professor at the Center for Microbiology and Environmental System Science. I study the functioning of ecosystems, focusing on microorganisms in soils and on the ecology of climate change. After watching this video, you will understand how photosynthesis and respiration cycle carbon between the atmosphere and the ecosystems on land and the ocean. You will also understand how this carbon cycle is linked to climate change and what carbon cycle climate feedbacks are. We are on the brink of an irreversible climate disaster. This is a global emergency beyond any doubt. These are the opening lines of a recent article in the journal Bioscience by some of the world's leading climate scientists. Terms like climate change, climate crisis, climate emergency, and climate disaster have become all too familiar to us. Whenever we hear about these terms, we also hear about carbon dioxide, carbon-climate feedbacks, and decarbonization. In short, about the carbon cycle. So what exactly is the link between the carbon cycle and the climate? In this video, I will walk you through what the global carbon cycle is and what it has to do with the climate crisis. Carbon is essential for life on Earth. In fact, about 45 to 50% of the dry mass of all organisms consists of carbon. The form of carbon in living organisms is known as organic carbon. In the atmosphere, however, carbon exists mainly as carbon dioxide or CO2 in the inorganic form of carbon. Through photosynthesis, plants on land and microorganisms in the ocean capture energy from the sunlight and transform CO2 and water into organic carbon. This organic carbon stores the sun's energy as chemical energy. During the process called respiration, organic molecules are broken down again into CO2, releasing energy that sustains life on Earth. Plant carbon is not only used by themselves, but also by other organisms such as herbivores, animals that feed on plants. These animals in turn are eaten by predators, forming an interconnected food web of carbon-based life. When plants or animals die, they become dead organic matter, which still holds enough energy to support highly diverse communities of microorganisms. In this way, carbon cycles continuously between the inorganic form CO2 in the atmosphere and the organic forms in living and dead organisms. This is the essence of the carbon cycle, a cycle powered by photosynthesis that has been ongoing for at least 3.4 billion years. Now let's take a closer look on the global carbon cycle. Today, the atmosphere contains around 880 gigatons of carbon, or billions of tons. On land, plant biomass holds around 450 gigatons, while soils store a staggering 3,000 gigatons of carbon, more than 3 times the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Each year, plant photosynthesis converts roughly 120 gigatons of atmospheric CO2 into organic carbon. This means that plants alone take up around 15% of the CO2 in the atmosphere annually. If this carbon didn't return to the atmosphere by respiration, the air would soon be devoid of CO2, halting photosynthesis and with it, life as we know it. The ocean also plays a major role in the carbon cycle. Around 90 gigatons of CO2 carbon are exchanged annually between the ocean surface and the atmosphere. When CO2 dissolves in the ocean, it converts mainly to bicarbonate and to a lesser extent to carbonate. Oceanic bicarbonate is then used by phytoplankton, microorganisms responsible for the photosynthesis in the ocean, to produce about 60 gigatons of organic carbon each year. Together, photosynthesis on land and on the ocean thus removes about 180 gigatons of CO2 carbon from the atmosphere annually. Quite significant, given that the entire atmosphere only holds around 880 gigatons of carbon. This strong impact of photosynthesis is why we see daily fluctuations and seasonal fluctuations in the atmospheric CO2. Over the past millennia, photosynthesis and respiration have generally balanced out, keeping the carbon cycle relatively stable. But human activities have dramatically disrupted this balance. How did humans do this? Humans have altered the carbon cycle in 2 major ways. First, humans have started already thousands of years ago to convert forests and grasslands into agricultural fields and pastures. By this land use change, humans have released carbon from the plant biomass and soil into the atmosphere as CO2. Second, humans have altered the carbon cycle by fossil fuel combustion. The Industrial Revolution required vast amounts of energy, which was, and still is, supplied largely by burning coal, oil, and natural gas. Fossil fuel combustion releases CO2 by breaking down organic carbon in these fuels in the presence of oxygen, quite similar to respiration. Fossil fuels are essentially ancient organic material that has been formed by photosynthesis millions of years ago and has never been released back to the atmosphere. That is, until we started burning them, releasing carbon on an unprecedented scale and fundamentally changing the carbon cycle. Methane, or CH4, is another atmospheric gas in the carbon cycle and the product of respiration in the absence of oxygen. Carbon dioxide and methane are both potent greenhouse gases that help keep the Earth warm. Without them, the planet's temperature would be around minus 18 degrees Celsius, too cold for life as we know it. But the excess of these gases is now driving the Earth's climate to a temperature level that is unprecedented in human history. In 2023, the global average temperature rose to about 1.3 degrees Celsius above the 1850 to 1900 average. Land temperatures have even increased by 1.9 degrees above pre-industrial levels. At the same time, atmospheric CO2 concentrations reached 420 ppm or parts per million in 2023, up 150% from the pre-industrial level of 280 ppm. Methane rose to 1.9 ppm, 265% above its pre-industrial level. And the concentrations of both greenhouse gases are further increasing. However, this release of carbon dioxide and methane to the atmosphere has not caused a simple linear increase in temperature, nor will it in the future. The reasons for this nonlinearity are what we call the carbon cycle climate feedbacks. So what exactly is a feedback? A feedback is a mechanism that either amplifies or dampens the initial change. Take this example of a positive feedback. Higher atmospheric CO2 levels cause warming, which speeds up the microbial decomposition of organic matter in soil, releasing more CO2 to the atmosphere. This added CO2 then leads to further warming. This is a positive feedback because it reinforces the initial change. A negative feedback works in the opposite way. For instance, a significant proportion of the additional CO2 humans released into the atmosphere during the last 60 years was taken up from the atmosphere by enhanced plant photosynthesis. In fact, only 45% of CO2 from fossil fuels and land use changes has ended up in the atmosphere. More than half has been absorbed in increased plant growth on land and uptake in the ocean, a negative feedback that already helps to mitigate climate change. However, as CO2 concentrations continue to rise, the capacity of land and ocean to absorb anthropogenic carbon is expected to decrease. Eventually, land and ocean ecosystems may shift from being carbon sinks at the moment to carbon sources, turning the helpful negative feedback into a harmful positive feedback. There are many known and probably many unknown carbon cycle climate feedbacks. One of the most concerning known positive feedbacks is the permafrost carbon climate feedback. Massive amounts of organic carbon, about 1,350 gigatons, almost twice as much as is in the atmosphere, are currently locked in permafrost soils. As temperature rises, permafrost thaws, making this carbon available for decomposition by microbes and releasing potentially enormous amounts of both CO2 and methane into the atmosphere. This feedback could significantly accelerate global warming. In summary, the carbon cycle is deeply intertwined with the global climate through greenhouse gases such as CO2 and methane. The complexity of carbon cycle climate feedbacks introduces a large degree of uncertainty into our climate predictions. As we continue to study these feedbacks, a better understanding of them will be crucial to effectively addressing the climate crisis.